So this is the fourth in our training series on CoC compliance this year. And today we're focusing on topics related to eligible costs and to some extent, some examples of how to document those eligible costs. So we'll start by going through the categories of eligible costs that you might or might not have in your CoC budget. We'll touch on indirect costs very briefly, and then we'll talk about a little bit about how to document staff costs, personnel costs through timekeeping, time and activity reporting. We won't be having a break in this hour-and-a-half training. We're just going to go straight through, but we are going to be pausing, as I mentioned, to prompt you to ask any questions that you have. We are also going to be throwing up every once in a while a little quiz, a little comprehension check using the Zoom poll function. And the real purpose of those quizzes is to activate this information in your brain, right? We're not expecting that everybody's going to get every quiz right. That's not the exercise. But we do ask that you try to participate in those quizzes, because the process of thinking about your answer and then hearing our explanation of what the correct answer is going to help this information sink into your brain. As was true of all of these CoC compliance trainings, this is going to be an overview of the topics of eligible costs and documentation of eligible costs. We are not going to dive particularly deep into any one of these cost areas. And we, therefore, as you go out and implement this information in the world, you're going to come across costs that you may want to charge to your C grant that we didn't explicitly cover with our words in this training. And for that, and just generally always, we are here for you to help you figure out, is this specific weird gray area cost eligible in my particular CoC budget? We'll talk a little bit about how you could try to address those questions, but ultimately what we're going to tell you is we're here for you as a resource, and you can always email or call us with those tough questions. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Monica to kick us off talking about eligible CoC program costs.
Great, thanks, Eli. So as Eli mentioned, we're going to go over each category in turn today. And to get us started on the next slide, we've got a handy mnemonic that helps us remember that generally all costs charged to CoC grants must be R, reasonable, necessary and directly related to the grant, A, allowable, eligible under the interim rule and directly benefiting the participant, D, documented, and acceptable documentation includes things like voided checks, paid bills, certified payrolls, time and attendance records. A, allocable, incurred directly for the purposes of a specific grant, contract, or program. And R, reimbursable, part of the budget and incurred within the eligible time frame. RADAR, radar. On the next slide, before we get into detail on eligible costs, it's important to understand the difference between eligible and approved costs under the CoC program. Both types of costs are allowable. Eligible costs are all of those costs that are included in the CoC program interim rule, such as rental assistance, leasing, supportive services, and operating costs, all of which we're going to go over today. Approved costs are the budget line items specifically approved by HUD in a project's grant agreement. As part of the annual CoC program competition, each applicant submits an application to HUD with a project budget. The budget requests CoC program funds to pay for specific costs, such as things like leasing or HMIS. HUD reviews the project application and budget, and if approved as submitted, incorporates it into the project's grant agreement with HUD. To amend a project budget, you have to request and receive prior HUD approval. There is a recent exception to this, which is that if a project requests supportive services or operations costs, it's not limited to the specific budget line items requested through that application. In those categories, as long as they are included in the budget generally, the project can spend awarded funds on any eligible supportive service or operations costs. These are the categories of eligible costs. First, I'm going to go over rental assistance, leasing, and supportive services. And then Eli is going to go over operating and administrative costs. So to start with rental assistance and leasing. Taking the right side of the slide first for leasing, leasing funds may be used to lease individual housing units for TH or PSH and can pay the full cost of leasing. In these cases, the rent has to be reasonable and not exceed fair market rent. So it's limited to the lower of fair market rent or rent reasonableness. Leasing funds may also be used for security deposits, first and last month's rent up to 2 months of rent, utilities if those are included in the rent, HQS inspections, and vacancies. Now looking at the other side of the slide, rental assistance funds can be used to make housing affordable by paying the difference between the actual rent for a unit and a percentage of a participant's income. With rental assistance funds, the rent must be reasonable, but it is not limited to fair market rent. And rental assistance may be used for things like first and last month's rent, security deposits up to 2 months of rent, HQS inspections, vacancies for up to 30 days from the end of the month in which a unit is vacated, and for any property damage caused by a participant, which is a one-time cost per participant up to the cost of 1 month's rent. I just want to note a brief asterisk here. We are presenting and recording this training on June 25th, 2020, and in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, HUD has made available several temporary waivers on CoC programs. Some of these waivers impact the fair market rent and rent reasonableness restrictions on leasing and rental assistance dollars. Programs who want to use HUD waivers need to meet certain requirements, and you'll want to check with your agency lead if you're not sure whether your program is using any waivers at this time. Moving on to the next slide. Given that rental assistance fluctuates based on participant contribution, it is possible for a program to have excess rental assistance funds. In such a case, you'll want to consult the interim rule for various options for spending out funds. One available option, of course, is you can serve more participants. Additionally, as I noted on the previous slide, you can cover things like security deposits, property damage, and costs of rent up to or over fair market rent, as long as the rent is reasonable. And you can move up to 10% of any one line item to another eligible approved line item. Other changes, including a change in the subpopulation you're serving, require HUD approval through a grant amendment. Switching gears now to supportive services costs. Programs can use supportive service funds to pay for a wide range of supportive services to assist participants with transitioning from homelessness to supportive housing. Eligible supportive services are listed in the interim rule, and we will go over those today. But first, as a general rule, all funded services must be necessary to assist program participants to obtain and maintain housing. And programs are required to conduct annual assessments of participants' service needs and should adjust services as needed. If supportive services are being provided directly by the program, eligible costs include the cost of labor, including staff salary and benefits, and supplies and materials directly related to providing services. On the next slide, we'll see that there are 16 different eligible supportive service costs to cover services necessary to assist program participants to obtain and maintain housing. Before we go over them in detail, a couple of notes. Eligible supportive services costs are limited to those specifically listed in the interim rule. And just because it's listed in the interim rule, it doesn't make it approved, reasonable, or reimbursable, all of which it needs to be. Also, the overarching eligible costs reflected on this slide are only guidelines. The interim rule identifies more specific service activities that are eligible under each supportive service category. The services you can provide with CoC program funds are further limited by those listed in your approved budget. This can get complicated, so if there are any questions as to what's an allowable cost, you'll want to reference the interim rule, your grant manager, the HUD field office, or of course, home base is here if you have any questions. I'm seeing that there is a question in the chat, and that question is, if you had to buy a client new clothes because they had a health concern and their old clothes were discarded, is this an eligible services cost?
That is a great question, and we may get to that in one of the upcoming slides. But while my non-encyclopedic memory of all of the specific supportive services costs is failing me. So while Monica is presenting, I'm going to go through our notes and try to hunt that one down. And I will put the answer in the Slack or in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eli. And yes, please do feel free to continue to use the chat for any questions. So let's start going through different categories. And while we do that, we'll see if we can find an answer to that question. And thank you for sharing it. So the first category that we will cover within supportive services is outreach services on the next slide. Outreach services are costs of engaging folks for immediate support and identifying potentially eligible program participants. Eligible activities and services within the outreach category include things like an initial assessment, addressing any urgent physical needs, such as providing meals, blankets, and toiletries, connecting folks with referrals for other programs, and publicizing available housing and services in the community. Eligible outreach services costs also include the outreach workers' transportation costs and a cell phone. The next category is case management. And I'm seeing we've got some additional questions. Keep them coming. We're going to go ahead and pause in a couple of slides to address those as a group. So the next category of supportive services is case management. These are the costs of assessing, arranging, coordinating, and monitoring the delivery of individualized services to meet a participant's needs. Allowable services and activities within the case management category include things like using the coordinated assessment system, monitoring and evaluating participants' progress, providing information and referrals to other providers, and developing an individualized housing and service plan. The next category of supportive services that we will cover is transportation. Eligible supportive services costs include the costs of travel for participants or service workers for certain eligible activities. For participants, it includes travel to and from medical care, employment, childcare, or other eligible services. For service workers, it includes travel for client visits and to carry out HQS inspections. These costs can be related to public transit or to a vehicle. The final category we'll cover before pausing is housing search and counseling services. As the name suggests, these are the costs of assisting participants to find and obtain suitable housing. Allowable activities within this category include things like tenant counseling, assisting clients with understanding leases, securing utilities, and making moving arrangements. Other eligible costs include landlord mediation, assisting clients with credit-related issues, and paying rental application fees. So let's take a pause here to consider an example together. And we're going to come up on our first poll in just a moment. The example is, A case manager has a client that is moving out of his apartment. Can you use CoC funds to pay for the move if you don't have a supportive services line item in your budget? And I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. And while we're considering this question, remember to go through radar on the bottom of your screen. Is this cost reasonable, allowable, documented, allocable, and reimbursable? And we'll give you some time to consider this question. We'll give folks just another couple of seconds to see if we can get 50% of participants voting in here. Okay, excellent. So we'll go ahead and share the results, and we've got a split, which is great. These are hard questions, and it's really helpful to get that immediate feedback from you that we can take some time to really go over this example. So the question again is, a case manager has a client that is moving out of his apartment. Can you use CoC funds to pay for the move if you don't have a supportive services line item? Though this is an allowable eligible cost under the interim rule, it's not a part of your budget, and so it's not reimbursable. Though, as I noted, supportive services costs are not limited to the specific budget line items requested through the application, and the project can spend awarded funds on any eligible supportive services cost, it does need to have a supportive services line item in its budget in order for it to be reimbursable. If you really want to use your funds for supportive services costs and the line item is not in your budget, you can submit a budget amendment. But first, you'll want to consider the time and effort it takes to do so. It can take over a month to process an amendment, so you'll want to talk to your HUD field rep first.
Monica, is this a good place to pause for those questions we had in the chat?
Perfect, thank you.
Awesome. So if you had to buy clients new clothes because they had a health concern and their old clothes were discarded, is this an eligible services cost? So from reviewing the cost listed in the interim rule, clothes are not listed as an eligible cost under any component that I could see. I'm going to look at some of the recent guidance related from HUD related to CoC program costs and COVID-19 response to see if there's any indication that this might be an appropriate use of funding. So I'm going to initially say, as far as I can tell, under normal circumstances, no, but we will get back to you about that after I've done a little bit more digging if it looks like it could be eligible. And then a question, what would be an example of staff activity cost that you could use extra rental assistance funds for? So as Monica mentioned, you can use rental assistance funds not just to pay rent and things like security deposits and some amount of damages. You can also use that to cover what HUD calls the staff costs of administering rental assistance. Some examples of those very common examples are the staff time cutting rental assistance checks, or generally administering the rental assistance payments, staff time doing HQS inspections, staff time including lead paint inspections. I believe and there's a range, a number of other staff costs that are a little bit less specifically defined by HUD in their sort of guidance outside of the interim rule. So if you have questions about specific staff costs that you think are very much tied to administering the rental assistance, you have to do these activities in order to pay rental assistance to a client, and you have questions about whether you can cover those, we're always happy to answer those questions specifically. But very common ones are literally the cutting of checks and administering the payments, HQS, lead-based paint. Yeah, and if I can come up with some other examples, I'll follow up with those in our follow-up email as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Eli. And thanks, folks, for your questions. Great. So looking at the next chunk of categories of supportive services costs, let's resume by looking at education services. Supportive service funds can be used to cover the costs of improving knowledge and basic educational skills, such as literacy, ESL, and GED. For each of the services listed on the left side of your slide, supportive service funds can be used for any of the component activities listed on the right side of the slide. So for example, within literacy services, supportive service funds can pay for assessment and testing, tutoring, instructional material, and referrals to additional resources. On the next slide, we will take a look at job training and employment assistance. These are the costs of establishing and operating programs to assist participants with acquiring learning skills, increasing earning potential, and securing employment. This could include providing classroom or, particularly relevant now, online instruction, or stipends for participants to engage in such programs. This could also include things like providing reference material, individualized job coaching, and referral to community resources. On the next slide, we'll consider how supportive services costs can be used for life skills training. This means the cost of teaching critical life skills that may never have been learned or may have been lost during the course of a client's life. The general rule is that these services must be necessary to assist the client to live independently. Examples of eligible life skills trainings include things like budgeting, conflict management, nutrition, using public transportation, and parenting. Speaking of parenting, on the next slide, supportive services funds can be used for childcare, including establishing and operating or providing vouchers for childcare. Any childcare center must be licensed to receive these funds, and eligible childcare services includes providing meals and snacks, as well as developmental activities. There are age restrictions for participants to be under age 13, or if they have a disability, to be under age 18. So now that we've considered a few more categories of supportive services, let's check in with another example. And I'm going to go ahead and launch our second poll. A case manager has a rapid rehousing client that needs one more class to get their GED to qualify for a job they want to apply for. Can you use CoC funds to pay for online GED courses if your budget already includes line items for group instruction, and I'm apologizing that it got cut out, and you print out enrollment receipts for the client's file? And again, in considering whether you can use CoC funds, remember to go through radar. Is it reasonable, allowable, documented, allocable, and reimbursable? And we'll give folks a couple more seconds. And if you need to move the poll aside on your slide, the slide does have the full question, which notes that enrollment receipts are printed out in the client's file. We'll give folks 5 more seconds to see if we can get over 50%. Okay, great. So, yes, we are unanimous at this time. It is reasonable for a client to complete this course as part of their work towards self-sufficiency. It's allowable as an eligible education cost. It's documented with printed out enrollment receipts in the client's file. It's allocable to a rapid rehousing program, and it's reimbursable as part of the budget. So yes, you can use CoC funds to pay for online GED courses in this instance. Great, thank you all for participating. Our final chunk of supportive services costs. As we of course know, clients may have a lot going on in addition to housing needs, and supportive services can include costs related to legal services, such as paying an attorney's fee for advice or representation in a matter that interferes with the client's ability to obtain and retain housing. Eligible subject matters include child support, guardianship, emancipation, protection orders, veterans or other benefit appeals, landlord-tenant, and resolving any outstanding criminal warrants. I will note here briefly that paying for legal services for immigration or citizenship matters are not eligible costs for CoC funding. Okay, almost done. Our next category is outpatient health services. This includes direct outpatient treatment by licensed medical professionals, including assessment, explaining health needs, and preventative medical care, as well as providing medication and follow-up visits, and this does include dental. Of course, mental health is as important as physical health, and on the next slide, outpatient mental health services are another type of eligible supportive service costs. This includes direct outpatient treatment by licensed professionals, and component services include crisis intervention, counseling, family or group therapy, and medication. Finally, to round out our coverage of eligible supportive services costs, we have food. Providing meals or groceries to program participants is an eligible cost. Substance abuse treatment services, including intake and assessment, outpatient treatment, counseling, and drug testing. And finally, utility deposits, so long as they're a one-time fee paid directly to utility companies. Thank you so much for your attention as we jam through supportive services costs, and please do continue to feel free to use the chat box for any questions. But for now, I will turn it back.
Thanks, Monica, for getting us so far through our eligible cost categories. Before we move on to the next line item that we're going to discuss, Pilar and anybody else who's interested in rental assistance, the cost of administering rental assistance, those staff costs, I did dig up a slightly longer list from, so what I'm referencing here is some startup training materials that HUD produced in 2013. It was a series of trainings for new grantees. Some of the information in the 2013 startup training materials is a little out of date, but a lot of it is still accurate. And because it's published by HUD on their website, it's something we consider as a reliable source of reference for this. So the list of activities that examples they give of the cost of administering rental assistance are processing rental payments, examining program participant income and family composition. So that would be doing the rent calculations that you do in order to establish the client portion of rent. That's staff time. Inspecting units for compliance, so HQS inspections, lead-based paint inspections, and receiving new program participants into a program if your program is specifically for rental assistance. So if rental assistance is all you have, then you can cover that with receiving new program participants into a program. That might also be part of your case management and your supportive services. So there's a little bit of a crossover there, but those are some examples that HUD gave. All right, switching gears a little bit. Our next line item, this is a line item you might have in your budget or you might not, is operating costs. These are costs that are associated with the sort of day-to-day operation of a building or maintenance of a unit where you are housing, where your clients are being housed. But it's specifically buildings or units that the program maybe owns or is leasing. This is not units that your clients themselves are leasing from a landlord, and not units that you're assisting with rental assistance funding. So you could combine operating costs with a leasing line item. You could never combine operating costs to support units that you're paying for with a rental assistance line item. We've listed some of the things that you can use operating costs for, things like maintenance and repair of the specific units that are assisted, that are serving your CoC clients. For example, building security. This is a question that we get a lot. We are housing clients in this building, and 20% of the units are assisted with CoC leasing funds, or they have CoC clients in them. And the other 80% are our clients, but they're not CoC assisted clients. Can we cover building security for the whole building? And the answer is you can prorate the cost of building security for the whole building and pay for the portion of the building security costs that are supporting your CoC clients. So essentially, like 20% of the building security costs you could cover with your CoC operating cost funding. That's a good example of how the costs that you're charging to your grant have to be allocable to the specific grant. They have to be actually supporting the CoC participants. And so I wanted to point that out because that's a question we get a lot. And of course, things like electricity, gas, other utilities that are eligible, those can be covered with operating costs as long as they're not already covered in your lease. If they're included in your leasing costs under your lease, or if the landlord is responsible for them under your lease, you're not going to be covering them with operating costs. Before I move on to the final line item, I wanted to take a moment to note some general billing practices, and this relates to some things that we've mentioned previously. But in general, the staff costs, the personnel costs of doing these eligible activities are eligible as part of that activity. So for example, case management, that's going to be almost all personnel costs. There might be some equipment, some materials involved in that, but that staff time carrying out the activity of case management, or the staff time carrying out the activity of connecting people to mental health services, all of that is eligible as part of that eligible activity, and you should bill it there. Okay. And I mention that because there's often a lot of questions about what does my admin line item, my admin budget cover? So administrative costs in the CoC grant context is a specific line item, very similar to your supportive services line item or your rental assistance line item. We often think about administrative costs in a sort of lay context, in a general context, as the same as overhead costs or the same as indirect costs, right? My admin costs in my agency budget are my overhead costs. They're the costs of running the agency. In the CoC grant context, when HUD says administrative costs, or when you have an admin line item in your CoC grant or in a sub-grant that has CoC funds in it, that admin line item is intended to cover a specific set of itemized administrative costs that are outlined in the CoC interim rules. So we're going to go over what those costs are. You can use your admin line item to cover what HUD calls general management oversight and coordination. We'll go over that in a second. Trainings for staff, specifically on CoC requirements or CoC sponsored trainings, and then environmental review. Administrative costs, right, so they're not going to include the staff and overhead costs that are related to doing the other eligible activities, which is what I referenced in the previous slide. So the specific personnel costs, including any overhead costs that you allocate in your staff sort of cost budget to a case manager, that's a case management cost. Okay, so going over these a little bit more, you can see general management oversight and coordination. Again, that sounds very much just like overhead. And it is fairly, it's a fairly long list of things, but it's a specific list of things. And what you need to do when you're figuring out what to put in that admin cost bucket is compare the specific costs that you want to be charging under admin to this list of eligible direct admin costs. If you have questions about that, again, you can reach out to us and we can go through your list of costs and do a little analysis of what we think fits under admin. This next slide just covers some other delineated costs that you can charge under this general management oversight and coordination component of admin, travel costs for monitoring if you have subrecipients, some general legal services, accounting services, audit services, and there's a list of some other eligible costs here. Now, the next slide, as you saw, is going to be about shared costs. And I want to point out that general legal services, that's an eligible admin cost. It's a cost of your organization that is necessary to administer this grant, but you can't bill all of your general legal services across your agency necessarily to your CoC grant. It's a shared cost. So that's what the type of costs we're going to be talking about. These are costs that benefit more than one grant or more than one activity or more than one funding stream that can't be reasonably directly tracked to each activity, right? So for that, the example on this slide, your staff time administering payroll, that is a cost. It's necessary in order to administer this grant. Generally, for the most part, we think that's very likely to be an eligible cost in your admin. But it's often, we find, really challenging, especially in larger organizations, to have your HR folks who are administering payroll literally fill out a time card that says, I spent this much time working on payroll for this grant, and I spent this much time working on payroll for that grant. That would be a ridiculous ask, right? So in that case, that's a shared cost. Your total, the time that a person spends administering payroll is a shared cost that benefits multiple grants if you have them, or multiple activities. You have to still allocate that cost based on, one, the actual expenses that you incurred for that staff time. So you can't do it as a budget projection. You have to allocate it based on the costs for the past month or the past 3 months of that staff time administering payroll. And it has to be allocated based on some reasonable estimate of the actual benefit to your CoC grant versus your ESG grant versus your agency internal fundraising funds. You have to allocate it based on the actual benefit to each activity. To do that, you want to have a written cost allocation plan. One example of this might be those payroll costs. You can just take the total cost of that staff time and split it up based on how much staff time generally, how many FTE were doing grant A versus grant B versus other activities, right? So you allocate it based on how much staff time, how much payroll burden was across those grants. This is an area that we have gotten a lot of questions on recently. And so if you're interested in checking your cost allocation plan, developing a cost allocation plan, we have specifically a summary of the federal rules on how to do this that we're happy to share with anybody. So feel free to reach out, send us an email, and ask for more information on allocating shared costs. And I see a question in the chat. Thank you. And it's about, okay, yeah, thank you. It's about the point I made when we were talking about operating costs, about prorating something like building security. So what if the size of the units was skewed in relation to the number of participants regarding repair and maintenance costs? So for example, 20% of participants are CoC, 80% are not, but the CoC participants encompass 30 to 40% of the square footage used to house the people. Does this change the proration based on the use of space? I think this is a great example of you want to make sure that your basis for allocation is reasonable and is directly related to the benefit that's being incurred. And I feel like either number of participants or sort of square footage and size could be reasonable basis for allocation for building security. In this case, I might actually lean more towards the size of the units. So yes, I think that could be a reasonable basis for splitting the building security costs. And I do think it is just based on the situation in your building, what makes most sense? What is the actual breakdown? For example, if you have 20 units, but some of them they're all the same size, but some of them have 2 people and some of them have 1 person, then the number of people might be reasonable, but also the square footage might be reasonable. It's just all about your specific situation. So it was a long way of saying, yes, I think that would be reasonable, but it's very situational. Okay, taking us back to this admin and shared cost allocation piece, I want to do a quick comprehension check here. I'm going to throw up a poll. And my question for you is, nope. Oh yes, which of these answers best describes the costs that you could cover with your CoC grant or your subgrant's admin line item? So your options are, my admin line item can cover my agency's overhead costs. My admin line item can cover just specifically the total personnel costs for administrative staff or departments. Or my admin line item can cover the specific costs that are described in the CoC program interim rule as admin costs. So of those 3, what do you think best describes what you can use your admin costs to cover? Okay, I'm seeing questions coming in. I'm hoping we get to that 50% mark with half of you participating. Oh, and we've just passed it. I'll give you a few more moments and then I'll close the poll. A few more moments to weigh in. All right, I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results. So great. I'm so glad that there was some disagreement here so I can talk more because I love talking. The correct answer here is the specific costs that are described in the CoC program interim rule is the best answer here. Because with your admin line item, you can't necessarily cover all of your agency's overhead costs. You may have some overhead costs that just aren't eligible under the CoC grant, and you'll have to find another way to cover those. Even if they're overhead costs which do benefit that grant, if they're not eligible, you can't cover them with the CoC grant. We know that this is a challenge that agencies experience, that you're trying to figure out, how do I cover these costs? It's not eligible for this grant, but it's benefiting that grant. It sometimes leaves you with a little bit of a gap that you have to try to cover. I recognize that, but at the same time, the HUD rules do say that those admin costs can only cover things that are specifically described in the interim rule as eligible costs. All right. So thank you. I know that you have been putting your questions in the chat box. I appreciate that. If you have follow-up questions at any time, just throw them in there. And at this point, I'm going to pass over to Nicole to do a pretty fantastic modeling activity for you.
Thanks, Eli. So now you're back working on your program and you're not sure if one of your costs is eligible or not. We're going to walk through the slide deck that we've been covering just to help model how you can use the slide deck to help match budget line items with eligible cost categories. So next slide, please. So your first cost is mileage and staff vehicle to serve clients. And we ask ourselves, sorry, could you just click? What eligible cost category might this fall under? Next slide, please. And so we're going to use this slide as our starting reference point because this lays out the categories of eligible costs. So we see rental assistance, leasing, supportive services, administrative costs, and operating costs. Now, it's been a while since I've gone through this slide deck. I haven't really been thinking about eligible costs. So it might not be immediately apparent where this might fit in. So I'm going to go through each one and see. Next slide, please. So with rental assistance and leasing, I see that it's funds to pay part or the full rent of a unit. I'm seeing things like security deposit, first and last month's rent, property damages, HQS inspections. I'm not seeing anything that pertains to mileage and staff vehicles to serve clients. So I'm going to move on. Next slide, please. With operating costs, I see that these costs have to do with the physical operation of a facility that the participant is housed in. So I'm seeing gas, but that's not relevant to my cost, which is mileage in a staff vehicle to serve clients. So I'll move on to the next category. With supportive service costs, here I'm seeing that it can include costs of labor and supplies or materials directly related to providing the services. This seems like it might align with what I'm looking for. And the example here is gas for an agency vehicle used to transport clients for the purpose of providing eligible services. So that seems close. So I feel pretty good about this one, but I'm gonna look a little closer. Next slide. I know there's a slide that lists out the costs in further detail, and here on this list, I see transportation, which is great. So I'm gonna go to the slide that specifically speaks to transportation in further detail. And here I see mileage allowance for service workers to visit clients and to carry out housing quality inspections. Mileage allowance, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Perfect, so it's a match. But like I said, it's been a while since I've been through this slide deck. I want to be extra thorough, just cover all my bases. So I might look at admin costs just to be extra sure. Next slide, please. So with admin costs, I'm seeing that this has to do with general management, oversight, training, nothing to do with mileage, but I'll just keep looking. Next slide, please. Here I'm seeing amending program budgets, compliance, audit, monitoring, findings. Okay, I feel pretty good that it's not gonna be here either. Next slide. I see travel costs, but these travel costs are for monitoring subrecipients, so I still feel good with my supportive costs category. Next slide, please. So now that I've been through all the eligible cost categories, I feel confident in matching this to supportive services transportation. And I would do this, again, only if supportive services was a line item that was approved in my project's budget. Next slide, please. So now our next cost is rental application fees. And again, we're asking the same question. Which cost category does this fall under? Next slide, please. So I go back to that same starting reference point and I look at the cost categories. And for this one, I might think rental application fees, rental assistance, they both have rental in the name. Maybe this is where I'm going to look. So I'll look there first. I go to the slide and I don't see anything that specifically has to do with rental application fees. I'm not going to definitively rule it out, but I am going to continue looking through the other cost categories. So I'll move on to the next one. Next slide, please. Operating costs, I'm not seeing any rental application fees here either. So I'll keep looking. Supportive service costs. Here I see that one of the bullet points says it must be necessary to assist program participants to obtain and maintain housing. Rental applications are a necessary component to obtain housing. So this might be what I'm looking for, but I'll look to more slides for further detail. Okay, so on this slide, I see a list, and I don't know, it might be moving costs, housing search and counseling services. It's been a while. I don't really remember what that specifically entails. It feels a little vague and ambiguous, so that might be something I want to look more into. Next slide, please. I know there's a specific slide that has more detail on housing search and counseling services. And here, there's payment of rental application fees. So that's a perfect match for what I'm looking for. Great. Next slide. So I match it to supportive services, housing search, and counseling services. Now, if you'll oblige me, we have one more example of a cost. Next slide. Which is an HQS inspection for a leased unit. So again, we're asking the same question. Which eligible cost category would this fall under? Next slide, please. We go back to that same reference point. Here with HQS inspections, I might think this falls under administrative costs because it has to do with compliance. So maybe I'll start there. Here I see environmental review. Maybe that seems close enough to me. So I'll just keep looking through this slide deck. Next slide, please. Here I'm seeing bullet points on preparing and amending the program's budget, compliance. Okay, that's great. Nothing specifically calling out HQS inspections though, so I'm going to keep looking. This is still admin costs. Not seeing anything here either specifically calling out HQS inspections. Again, not definitively ruling anything out, but just I'm going to keep looking. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move on to a different category just to make sure. And so I've gone back to rental assistance and leasing costs, and here there are HQS inspections. So this is a perfect match. I'm not going to look any further because I remember that the other cost categories don't have anything to do with this. So next slide, please. Here I just want to note that some costs like HQS inspections, you might think might logically fit into multiple categories. For example, I thought it might fit into admin costs. But HUD has explicitly housed them under rental assistance and leasing, so they need to be billed under that line item. And as Eli mentioned, HQS inspections are directly related to administering rental assistance and leasing because they're required before you can spend funds on the unit. Eli also mentioned some other activities that could be included in costs directly related to administering rental assistance and leasing, for example, lead-based paint inspections. That isn't specifically noted on the slide, so I might forget that. That's a perfect example of when you should feel free to reach out to Homebase, and we would be more than happy to confirm that for you. But that was just a little modeling example, and hopefully you can see how you could use the slide deck to help confirm these costs. I am seeing some.
Yeah, so I can, I've been tracking the questions. Do you mind if I take over for the questions, Nicole? Awesome. And I think this really flows super well from the activity we just did, and also gives you a little insight into our world of answering these TA questions. So the questions that have come up in the chat, so there was one about rental assistance in a property you own that I'll come back to. But there were a couple that I saw that related to, so if supportive services isn't an approved line item in the budget, are you saying that mileage that's related to clients isn't allowable? And then I got some direct questions about, well, when the second example was using supportive service, or one of the examples was using supportive services, transportation costs to pay for mileage going to do HQS inspections, right? But we've said that HQS inspections are related to administering rental assistance. So we know that the staff costs of HQS inspections, the staff time, is clearly allowable under rental assistance. So it's a great question. Then what about this mileage for doing HQS inspections? Is it supportive services? Is it rental assistance? Could it be both? So if we got this question, and we have, but if we got it over email from you all, what we would do is the exact analysis that Nicole just did. And we would say, okay, so it's specifically called out under supportive services. If I have a supportive services line item, it's listed in black and white in the interim rule. I can use supportive services costs to cover mileage for HQS inspections. If I don't have a supportive services line item, then I'm going to dig a little deeper and I'm going to say, okay, well, there's this rental assistance, costs of administering rental assistance, which includes HQS inspections. And I would tell you that if you don't have supportive services, it's very likely that this HQS mileage is eligible under rental assistance. And just based on what HUD has said about HQS inspections being cost of rental assistance, mileage is a necessary cost of doing that. So just generally speaking, we would say, yeah, you can bill it to rental assistance as well. And then it comes down to how obsessively risk averse do you want to be? Because technically speaking, to get a really firm, clear, positive answer that is okay, you would have to submit a question to HUD's Ask a Question portal. And so that might be something that we say to get a firm, yes, HUD has specifically spoken to this point, you could submit a question to AAQ. most grantees are not going to need that type of obsessive confirmation because it is so reasonable. It's such a reasonable argument to say that HQS mileage is part of the cost of doing HQS. Costs of doing HQS are eligible under rental assistance. We're going to bill it there. We would say that that is completely reasonable and very likely is not going to have any problem for most HUD monitors. So it's a good example of a place where it's a little tiny bit gray, and things get a lot more gray than that. Things get a lot more a lot less clear, a lot more vague in the HUD guidance. That one, I would say we'd feel pretty comfortable billing HQS mileage to rental assistance, but we're always going to point out where there is any bit of gray, because these are grants that you all are administering, and ultimately our goal is to give you all the best information we can and to help you make a decision how to move forward. So I hope that was more helpful than it was confusing. If you're in that situation where you have something that it seems like it makes so much sense to bill it here, but I can't find it in the rule, it doesn't say it specifically, that's another good place to have a conversation with us, have a conversation with OSH, particularly if they're the direct grantee for your grant, because it really is, somebody is going to make a judgment call there. And it really should be the grant recipient that's making that judgment call. And we're here to help with our best information. Asking HUD directly is always an option for these particularly gray situations. All right. And then I want to go back to the question that I mentioned first that I skipped over. So this relates to operating rental assistance costs. And the specific situation is if you're an owner of a property and your grant has operating funds currently, and you want to convert those operating funds to rental assistance, is there a problem because owners can't pay themselves rent? And the basic answer is yes. The general rule is you can't use CoC rental assistance funds in a building or a unit that you own or that your parent organization owns. There's a description of all of the people who can't own the building. There is kind of an exception to this. Technically, you could reach out to HUD and explain your situation and ask for permission to pay yourself rental assistance. But typically, we expect that to be a little bit of an extraordinary situation. Maybe there is no other housing in the community. That's something that has come up in rural communities. Or there's just a really specific structure of technically this organization is part of us and they own the building, but they're not actually part of us. You could make that kind of argument. But generally speaking, no, you can't pay rental assistance to yourself. Hope that was helpful. Okay. Thank you so much for those questions. We appreciate it. All right. Speaking of questions, the next thing we're going to talk about is indirect costs. This is, again, something that we get questions about a lot. I'm not going to answer all of the possible questions about indirect costs. And if you find yourself having in-depth questions, put them in the chat. I may suggest that we follow up later on those questions just for the sake of time, but I definitely will follow up on them. So if you have questions coming up, put them in the chat. Okay, indirect costs are in contrast to admin costs, which is a specific line item in your budget that has a set of eligible costs associated to it. The indirect costs option is the ability to charge some of those more shared costs, those overhead costs, that it is really challenging to directly allocate to a grant month by month or quarter by quarter. So the indirect costs for the CoC grant and for federal grants generally are governed by the uniform guidance issued by the Office of Management and Budget. That's found in the Code of Federal Regulations at 2 CFR 200. And indirect costs are partially covered at 200.414 if you're a nerd like me and want to look at the regs. Indirect costs are defined as costs that are incurred for a common purpose, so a single thing like your general legal costs for your agency that benefit more than one objective, more than one cost objective, so more than one grant, more than one project, and can't be easily tracked to individual projects. So this is very similar description to shared costs that I mentioned earlier. And sometimes your shared costs and your potential indirect costs, those categories do overlap, but you always need to if you have a cost that could be a shared cost that is directly billed to a line item, or it could be a shared cost that's billed as indirect, you have to pick for that specific cost how you're going to treat it, and then it has to stay in its lane. You can't be moving costs back and forth. If you're going to use the indirect cost option, you need an indirect cost rate. So like I said, this isn't a line item in your budget that you're just going to bill to. This is an approach to covering these costs. You need to come up with, choose the indirect cost rate that you're going to use. So you have two options. You can use a negotiated rate, meaning that you negotiated with the federal government through one of their agencies to identify what to agree on with HUD. These are your overhead costs. This is how we're going to define your direct cost base. And then this is the appropriate rate that you're going to bill. Your other option may be a de minimis rate. The de minimis rate is always a 10% rate that's applied to your modified total direct costs. So we're going to live a little bit in this really wonky finance accounting world for a second. I apologize. The 10% rate of modified total direct costs is an option for nonprofit recipients of grants or subrecipients who have never had a negotiated rate with the federal government. If your agency has ever had a negotiated rate, maybe with the VA or another federal agency, then you cannot use the de minimis rate for your CoC grants now. You have to go back to a negotiated rate. But if you haven't, then this may be an option for you. I want to point out that because of how HUD defines modified total direct costs, 10% of MTDC is often very small for our CoC grants, especially if you have rental assistance. Those rental assistance checks are not included in your modified total direct cost base. So if you subtract out your rental assistance costs, 10% of what is left over might be fairly small. So just to let you know. Indirect costs don't increase your grant amount, right? So you have these line items in your grant that equal up to your full grant amount. And the way you would charge your indirect costs is you would find, okay, these are all of my direct costs in my supportive services line item that fall within my direct cost base. I'm going to apply my indirect cost rate to those direct costs in my supportive services line item. That's my indirect cost amount, and I'm going to include that in my supportive services invoice to HUD. But you can't exceed the total amount of supportive services that you have in your budget, that you have in your grant. So across all of your line items, you're going to do that. And it just means if you have $100,000 in your grant, some portion of that $100,000 will be billed as direct costs, and then some portion will be billed as indirect. It's not additional funding. In order to draw down indirect costs, you really should indicate that you plan to use indirect costs in your CoC project application. You're going to tell HUD whether you have a federal negotiated rate or you're using the de minimis rate. If you have a negotiated rate, then you're going to follow that agreement that you have and use that rate. And then when you draw down, as I described in the last slide, your indirect cost rate should be applied to the direct cost base in each line item. And that's how you're going to actually bill it. Okay, so quick comprehension check here, more just a reminder. And that is, let me pull it up. If you're interested in drawing down indirect costs, or you think you may be interested, what would be a good next step at this point? You're not doing it yet, you might be interested. Should you reach out to us for more information? Should you maybe consult an accountant or an auditor that has specific expertise in federal grant compliance and knows 2 CFR 200 like the back of their hand? Should you maybe reach out to the field office to talk about what they recommend as next steps? Or could you do any of the above or all of the above? I'm going to give you a chance to weigh in there on this really sticky, controversial question that we've put up. Yeah, I'm seeing some responses coming in, potentially only from the people who have any interest in indirect costs at all, which is totally fine. I'm going to see if we can get a few more people weighing in here. And I'm going to close the poll in a few seconds here. All right, we've got 50%. Yeah, and the great thing is that you're all right, because you could do any or all of the above. We definitely have more information about indirect costs than we just told you. And there are a lot of details about indirect costs and how they differ from charging shared costs directly to your line items, and what the regs say, and what we know and what we don't know. There's a whole lot of HUD FAQs that we can send you, so you can definitely ask us for more information. We often recommend, even if you're talking to us, if you're serious about indirect costs, that you do consult an accountant or an auditor with expertise in federal grant compliance. That can be hugely helpful in terms of the nitty-gritty, how do I implement this? And then in some situations, talking to your field office can be a really great resource, because they know specifically your grant and you know what steps you're going to take when you get to that point in ELOCs, what it's going to look like to actually draw down these indirect costs. All right. Thank you for that. There's a question in this chat, and we'll see if we can answer this. Okay. So the operating costs detailed here, which I think means on the slide, appear limited to the facility or unit the clients are housed in. Is it possible that direct program operating costs, so client-related travel, direct staff telephone, direct facilities charges, are included in the HUD portion of a program grant? Yeah, so client-related travel, staff telephone, office supplies, facilities charges, etc. Those are all examples of the costs of the staff costs of carrying out an activity. So if you have telephone, office supplies, things like that, that are being used by a staff person to do case management, or are being used by a staff person to do another part of their job, then you can allocate that portion of those costs that is directly supporting the staff person to do that part of their job to that part of the CoC budget. So if you have people who are billing their time to the admin line item, and they have telephone costs and office supplies and other things that they're using to do their job, you can figure out a reasonable portion of those costs that is allocated to that staff time and bill that to your admin line item. Or if it's a case manager, you can bill it to your supportive services line item. Or if it's someone who is, again, cutting checks for rental assistance, you can bill it to your rental assistance line item. I hope that answers that question fully, but if not, feel free to do a follow-up there. Okay. Great. I'm glad that was helpful. Now, in the interest of time, timekeeping, we're going to go quickly over the concepts of timekeeping here. Oh, there we go. I do want to start with just a plug for timesheets in general. As someone who fills out a timesheet at home, as we all do at home base, we track our time in 15-minute increments to a bunch of different projects that we're working on. And it is, let's just say, not my favorite part of my job. And yet I try to do the best I can to do that in a timely way and to keep it updated, because I understand from doing these trainings how important it is. So without an accurate record of time for these CoC grants, I mean, it's just difficult to project what the cost of future activities is going to be. I know that if I don't track my time accurately, then my team lead and our managing director are not going to be able to estimate the cost of the next project that we do that's similar, because they won't know how much time it's going to take for us. And I also know that to the extent we get any grants, I'm not going to, my organization's not going to be compliant with grant requirements if they can't see exactly how much time I've spent on each activity. We're not going to be able to submit reimbursement requests that are accurate, and ultimately we or our clients may, in the worst case, end up having to pay back grant funds if I'm not filling out my timesheets accurately. I don't want to put all of this on each of us individually, right? There's a whole agency trying to make this happen. There's a whole structure of compliance in place in most cases. But it's important that we do our part in filling out our timesheets. And things that I have found to be helpful for me is just trying to build in time to do it, but finding an approach that works for me. So I've tried doing it at the end of the day. I've tried doing it at the end of the week. I've tried writing it down on a paper and then transferring it onto the computer later. Right now, what works best for me is just to do it as I switch between activities, because personally for me, I'm usually at my computer. But I think the important thing is to find something that works for you and cuts down the burden as much as possible. Okay, so given that plug, why am I talking about timesheets? In order to bill HUD for time that our staff is spending on a particular activity, you have to document that staff time. Again, the regulations that govern are the uniform guidance, and this time it's at 2 CFR, which is Code of Federal Regulations, 200.430. What the uniform guidance says is actually fairly general about what needs to be in this documentation of staff costs. It has to, whatever this documentation is, it has to be able to support the allocation of that staff time among specific activities or cost objectives. What that means is you have to track time to a grant. It has to be really clear that this time was benefiting this grant. You have to have a sort of standard way of tracking time and of incorporating that into your official record keeping. The particular time tracked for a particular staff person has to include the total time for which the employee is compensated. So your method for documenting staff time has to include not just the time spent on a CoC grant. It has to include the time spent on other activities, on internal activities, even on vacation, which is compensated, or sick time, which is compensated by the organization. And then, of course, your time tracking has to be part of a system of internal controls to make sure that that staff time tracking is accurate and that charges to a CoC grant are going to be allowable and also properly allocated between that grant and other things that you're doing. And you should have your own accounting policies and practices that govern the timekeeping. We often talk about time and activity reports. This is still a relevant concept, even though the uniform guidance no longer specifically references time and activity reports. It's a phrase that's sort of a holdover from the previous guidance. But our best recommendation is to continue thinking of time and activity reports in order to comply with these fairly general statements. We find that this is what HUD is looking for. So a time and activity report in its totality has to account for actual time worked. It can't be an estimate, it can't be a projection, it can't be a percentage of FTE or a percentage of that person's total time. It has to be actual time. It needs to be pretty specific to the time worked too, so you don't have to track time by the minute or by the 5 minutes, but tracking time in 4-hour chunks probably isn't going to be specific enough to the actual time worked, unless you literally did work for 4 hours on the same thing. You have to track time specifically to eligible activities and eligible participants served. So not just, I was doing a supportive services thing for this CoC grant. Just having that in your record is not going to be enough. Your record has to reflect which client was being served so that HUD can verify that that client is actually a CoC supported client. And it has to reflect what were you doing with that client. I was doing a monthly case management meeting, or I was doing an annual reassessment of income. What is the thing that you were doing so that HUD can confirm that it was eligible? All of this has to align with the other backup documentation that you're pulling in to support. For example, you may reference case notes, or you may reference a case manager's calendar in order to support that that was how they were spending their time. You need to track all of the staff time, as I mentioned, so time that can be billed to the CoC grant, as well as time that is ineligible costs and can't be billed to a CoC grant. And then if you have multiple grants that a single staff person is working on a CoC grant and an ESG grant, and then doing some internal work that's internally funded, you have to track to those specific funding sources so you can see the full time that the staff person is spending in your agency. Okay. So big takeaways: track time by grant, by client, and by eligible activity, and track all time. It's a short way of saying all of the babbling I did earlier. Some things that we see that are immediately concerning, so some red flags, are when case managers or any staff person really is billing 8 hours in a single day to one grant. That is a red flag, because, or just a total time, depending on however long their workday is. That's a red flag because it's really unusual for someone's full time in a day to be eligible to be charged to a CoC grant. And it's also pretty unusual for someone just to be working on one grant all day. Even if that's the case, though, we want to see not just a block of 8 hours, but we want to see, listed out, like, this hour and a half was on this eligible activity, and this half hour was on this eligible activity, because just 8 hours billed to one single grant is both not adequate documentation, but it's also it's just pretty unlikely. So it's going to be a red flag for HUD also if they're doing the monitoring. Just not doing all of the things that I mentioned earlier. So making sure that your time and activity reporting is reviewed against your invoicing, and that your invoicing is actually based on this reporting. It's not going to do you any good to have really accurate time and activity reporting if you're not invoicing based on that. So time and activity reports that don't include any sick time or vacation time, that's going to be if you're looking at overtime, you're never seeing sick time or vacation time being billed. That's going to be a problem, because either your staff is not taking vacation, which is concerning in itself, or you're not including that in your reporting, and you really need to be. And then one of the big things we see is that the total time and activity reporting materials, documentation, are missing one of these things. Maybe they're missing, they indicate what client was being served and what grant they're served by, but it doesn't specify an eligible activity. It just says to the supportive services line item, but it doesn't say what eligible supportive services thing you were doing. Or it says the eligible activity, but it doesn't indicate the client that was being served. The main takeaway I think we have for you for documentation in general, because this is documenting eligible costs, if you don't document it, then HUD assumes it's not eligible, right? If you don't document that this was the client that was being served, and you can't prove to HUD that this was the client that was being served, then HUD is going to assume that you weren't serving an eligible client, even if you were, right? So if you don't document it, it really doesn't do you any good to be doing the right thing. Okay, so I have been talking about time and activity reporting. I haven't been saying timesheets. And that's because your time and activity reporting doesn't all have to be in your timesheet. It can be really nice and luxurious to just have a timesheet that has all of the pieces in it and tracks time really specifically. When you have a notes section that everybody is really rigorously using, and the notes include the client and the activity, but we don't always have that. We don't always have that type of timekeeping system available. So what you need to be able to do is combine your timesheets and your actual time tracking with some other backup documentation. For example, being able to run a report of case notes or of case manager time from HMIS or from your internal case management system that will easily align with and back up your timesheets. Or having some other place where you keep pieces of this information. If that's how you're addressing this, right? If you are pulling together all of this required information from your timesheets and maybe case notes and a couple of places, you really need to be able to pull this quickly and easily when HUD comes to do a monitoring with your agency. If HUD has to search around, or if you have to search around for a couple of days in order to find all of the backup documentation, then, on the one hand, it's good if you can give them the proof that you are spending your costs eligibly in an eligible way, because they're probably not going to then make you repay those costs. But on the other hand, you're probably still going to get at least a concern, if not a finding, in your monitoring, because part of your responsibility is to be able to produce these time and activity reports when you need to document your invoicing. And you need to be able to self-monitor. So if you're spending 3 days pulling together the information in order to prove that your costs are eligible and your staff time is eligible, then HUD is thinking, well, you can't monitor yourself. You can't check every time you invoice us that you're actually invoicing us for eligible costs. So that's a huge problem, because we need you to be invoicing us for eligible costs. And if you can't check, then you don't know that you're doing that. So if you're using multiple sources, just try to work towards a place where you can run those reports and pull together that information and cross-reference it relatively quickly. Okay, so I was a little bit wordy, so we're going to go quickly through these activities before we wrap up. I just want to show you some examples of types of time and activity reports. These are specifically examples of what a timesheet might look like if you're just using a timesheet for sake of simplicity. And I'm going to point out some red flags. So the gaps here, right? I'm seeing time for this person tracked to grants, which is great, but I'm seeing 8 hours per grant and I'm not seeing any other information. I don't know what this person was doing for 8 hours on June 1st in order to, serve that grant, to support those clients. I don't know who the clients were. So if this is all I'm seeing as documentation, then it's not going to be enough. This is not a compliant time and activity report. This is a little better, right? So I'm confident I'm tracking vacation, which is good. I'm seeing specific time being tracked, not just to grants, but a little bit to the activity, the general activities, so case management or training. There's not quite enough information here for me to know whether this is eligible, right? I don't know what kind of case management was happening. There are some things that I might describe as case management that HUD hasn't included in their interim rule. So I might want to combine this timesheet with case notes that clearly show that this is the activity that I was doing during that case management time, and to show that the training was actually a training that is eligible under supportive services line item. Now this is a timesheet that I could probably just use as my time and activity report. It tracks time to individual clients, to a specific eligible case management activity. It's broken down by time, it's tracked to grants. So this includes all the things we're looking for. We have covered everything that we intended to cover today. I'm seeing that I lost sound for a second, so I'm going to keep presenting, but Monica and Nicole, let me know if I cut out. Okay, great question. Are there any updates on HUD site visits or HUD monitoring this year? I believe they'd all need to be remote or a desk audit. I actually don't have recent information on that. I know that some HUD monitorings that were happening a little bit ago, like right in the middle of the beginning of shelter in place, were just remote or desk audit. I don't know what the current status of that is, but I can follow up with you, Jana, about that. Okay, thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you for your focus and your participation. We Really, really appreciate your time at these trainings and your focus on compliance, which we know is not the most important piece of your day-to-day, but can be really important for maintaining these federal funding streams. We're going to be sending out a feedback survey, and we really, really ask that you take a second to fill those out. We have always used those feedback services to make substantive changes in the way we offer these trainings. And we're entering a little bit of a new space on Zoom and doing online trainings, so we can use all of the feedback about that in particular that you can. So we really appreciate you taking some time to fill those out. As Nicole always says, she literally does read everyone, and then we talk about it as a group. So look out for that. And also look out for this training recording and the slides to be coming to you. And please reach out to us if you have any questions at any time. Thank you all so much for everything that you do. We really appreciate you, and I hope you have a great day.